So, growing up in the mid to late 2010s, I'm sure most of us all remember reading those classic video game creepypastas. Stuff like Polybius, Binge Round, Mr. Mix, The Theater, Lavender Town Syndrome, Hero Brian, supposedly cursed games that if we ever played them, we would surely meet an untimely fate. Now, the stories honestly have not aged that well, but looking back on them now, we can kind of appreciate them as our first step into the world of horror, and we can at least sleep well at night knowing that playing these games won't actually do any harm to us. Well, mostly. Berzerk is a 2D multi-directional shoot-'em-up released in arcades in October of 1980. The whole premise of the game is that you're just a dude in a maze and you go around and shoot down the many robots that also appear in the maze. All the while, the game's main villain will follow the player around and, if they're not careful enough, will eventually kill them. The villain in question? A singular round smiley face by the name of Evil Otto. Now, obviously, like viewing this through modern eyes, Berzerk probably doesn't seem all that impressive, but you gotta remember, for 1980, this was actually very cutting edge. For instance, this was one of the first games where you could actually explore multiple rooms, not just one, as opposed to something like Pac-Man or Space Invaders. And, more importantly, it was one of the first games to ever feature digitized sound. I know these sound like basic features in gaming, but for its time, they were huge. I mean, keep in mind, jumping wouldn't even be invented for a whole nother year. For what it's worth, Berzerk ended up being a huge hit in arcades. It also ended up being a huge hit in the home. The Atari 2600 version is one of the best-selling games on the console. And today, it's widely considered one of the most influential games of all time. It would go on to inspire games such as Metal Gear, and then later on it would inspire Castle Wolfenstein, which of course gave us Wolfenstein 3D, which then of course gave us Doom, which then of course gave us the entire first-person shooter genre. All this from Berzerk. However, I've neglected to mention that there is a far more sinister side to Berzerk's legacy. If you go online, if you go on YouTube and you look up Berzerk, you'll find your classic gameplays, you'll find your classic reviews of it. What you'll also find are videos related to the 3 real deaths that surround the game. I want to emphasize 2 of these deaths are without a shadow of a doubt real. These are the Berzerk deaths.
Attacks are humanoid. Chicken fight like a robot.
There's an airplane going over my house right now. I don't know if y'all can hear it. Hopefully not. In the final months of 1981, Illinois would be hit with some of its worst winter storms on record. Over 30 inches of snow in 1 month alone. These storms would carry over into April of the next year. On the 3rd day of April in 1982, Peter Bukowski woke up to what he thought would be a normal day. He would hang out with his girlfriend, and then he would go play some video games over at the local arcade. The only problem is, Peter didn't drive. So he would be trekking through the thick snow all day. Now, I couldn't find an exact timeline of what happened, so if I get anything wrong in the comments, please let me know. So Peter started the day by going over to his girlfriend's. He hanged out there for a few hours, and then he walked over, and let me emphasize, in the heavy snow, over to his friend's house. Sometime during the evening, one of his friends brought up the idea of going to the arcade. Peter liked the idea, and so they all went. He arrived at the arcade at about 8 p.m. The first machine that caught his eye was the very popular Berzerk machine. He played 2 games, supposedly got a high score, took 2 steps away from the machine, and then he would collapse onto the arcade floor. Immediately, CPR would be performed and an ambulance would be called. However, he would be pronounced dead upon his arrival at St. Margaret's Hospital in the nearby town of Hammond. Within the following days, it would be revealed that Bukowski had passed from a heart attack. Now, this would confuse many people. He was young. He was only 18 at the time, and from all accounts, he was perfectly healthy. So, why did he have a heart attack? Well, to answer this question, we can look at testimonials that Peter's friends gave that day. Apparently, according to his friends, he was just not feeling well at all. Like, on the way to the arcade, they stopped at a convenience store and he drank an entire soda because he was just so thirsty. And all throughout the day, his friends said that he was constantly out of breath. In the days following his death, his parents would order an autopsy on him, which would actually answer all of our questions. It was revealed that Bukowski had a condition known as right arrhythmogenic ventricular cardiomyopathy, a very rare heart disorder that only usually affects people around his age. I'm not a cardiologist by any means, so I'm going to try to explain this in as simple terms as I can, but essentially it's just where healthy heart tissue dies and is replaced by scar tissue. From what it seems Peter's heart attack was a long time coming. Anything could have set it off. It just so happened that Peter did a number of things that day that would have set it off. As you probably already know, the snow was heavy that day, and Peter had to trek through 4 miles of it to get to all of his locations. That probably already sealed his fate, but even before then, you gotta factor in that he went to a convenience store and drank an entire soda, which definitely didn't help. In all honesty, he was probably already dead as soon as he entered the arcade. It just so happened that the straw that would break the camel's back would be the excitement of playing Berzerk. In the weeks following, rumors would spread about Berzerk's involvement in Bukowski's death. It would be so great that the arcade owner, the same one Bukowski died at, would take the Berzerk machine off the floor for several weeks. In the following years, this story would fall into the depths of simply being another urban legend, another myth that you would tell your friends at school about. But not before another story was unearthed, featuring what seemed to be an almost identical case. That is until you take a deeper look at it. Within the weeks of Bukowski's death, another story that occurred a year ago would begin to creep back into the spotlight. One very similar to Bukowski's. Now, there are so many discrepancies and inconsistencies that I found with this, so I'm just going to do a basic rundown and then go over them. But I should probably mention that even the date is debated on. Some say it was January 12th, 1981. I've seen January 19th, 1981. Some say it happened in May 1981. It's just not fully confirmed. Okay, so in the early weeks of 1981, Jeff Daly would visit his local arcade in his home state of Virginia, where he would immediately be attracted by the Berzerk machine. He would then play for hours and hours and hours and hours on end. Some say with only 1 quarter, but we'll get to that. And after finally achieving a high score, he would take a few steps away from the machine, drop dead of a heart attack, just like Bukowski. This would take an even more sinister turn once it was reported that he reached a high score of 16,660. I'm sure you can figure out what those middle numbers are supposed to represent. One problem. This story might have never happened. So, first issue, you've probably noticed I didn't give a location to the arcade or even the town in which this happened in, and that's because I couldn't find it. I couldn't find where this arcade was. I couldn't even figure out the name of the arcade, what town it happened in. The only consistent information I can find is that it happened in Virginia, and that's only somewhat consistent because according to some people, this incident took place at Friar Tuck's arcade room. Yeah, and apparently he was close friends with Bukowski. Also, while we're at it, let's go ahead and debunk that high score. So, as you probably remember, he died after receiving a high score of 16,660 after hours of playing on 1 quarter. Many, experts at Berzerk, for lack of a better term, pros, said that a score of 16,660 after all those hours would be pretty pitiful and honestly, possibly impossible. Possibly impossible. Did I really just say possibly impossible? So, based on all the discrepancies and the inconsistencies, I personally do not believe that in January of 1981, A 19-year-old boy by the name of Jeffrey Daly died while playing Berzerk after reaching a score of 16,660. What I do believe is that in the first half of 1981, a 19-year-old named Jeff Daly would die under very tragic circumstances. I was able to find a website called findagrave.com where essentially you can locate graves from all across the country, and I was able to locate a 19-year-old Jeffrey Allen Daly in Suffolk, Virginia. Now, from what I hear, I've seen various resources say it was because of this. I've not been able to fully confirm it, but it seems that the real Jeff Daly died of an automobile accident, not a heart attack. And not only that, he didn't die in January, he died in May, and we can conclusively place that he was nowhere near Illinois, nowhere near Friar Tuck's game room, nowhere near Peter Bukowski, and this is just a completely separate, unrelated incident that somehow got mixed together. I tried to figure out why they would mix these together, and I thought about it, and here's my idea. Bukowski's death came out of nowhere. It was a shock, it was a surprise, it didn't make sense. And I guess to kind of make sense of it to a lot of people, they would hear about another story about a young man who passed away the year before who happened to be a big fan of arcade games. It's just a kind of attempt to explain the unexplainable. We can safely say that the very unfortunate loss of Jeff Daly was not the result of a killer video game. As 1982 turned into 1983, this case would also fade away into being just another urban legend. That would be until the third and final death we're going to talk about, and how fitting we end at the same place we started. We once again visit Calumet City, Illinois, and the Friar Tuck Game Room, and I want to emphasize this is not a rumor, this is not an urban legend, it is the same exact arcade that Bukowski died at. 17-year-old Edward Clark Jr. wanted to get some last-minute arcade games in because it was a Sunday before he would go back to school. Now, immediately upon entering the arcade, Clark would spot a machine that had a big stack of quarters and no one manning it, and figured, hey, free game, why not? I don't know why I just did that. The arcade game in question would be widely reported to be Berzerk. I say widely reported because it's never been fully confirmed that it was Berzerk, but I'm just gonna take it with a grain of salt and we're just gonna say it is Berzerk. However, once he started playing it, he would be confronted by a kid named Pedro Roberts. For extra context, it seems as that there was already bad blood between the two. There were rumors that Clark had stolen one of Robert's girlfriends. Nothing confirmed. I mean, they're just rumors. I mean, they could just be, your typical schoolyard rumors. Nothing confirmed, but something to keep in mind. And I should also mention, even at the age of 16, Roberts was already a very, very troubled kid. The two would then have an argument over who had the next play at the arcade, which would then turn into a full-blown altercation, which some say was just a swearing match, and some say was just a full-on fist fight. No matter what, the altercation was severe enough that would end up getting both of them kicked out of the arcade. Now, instead of kicking them out together and having another altercation in the parking lot, they decided to kick them out separately 10 minutes apart. After 10 minutes had passed, Clark was allowed to leave, and one of the clerks at the arcade said, maybe go a different way than the way you came before. Clark ignored him, which would be a mistake that would cost him his life. Upon leaving Friar Tuck's, Clark would walk down the same route that Roberts went down. What Clark didn't know is that in a nearby alleyway, Roberts was waiting. As soon as he crossed his path, Roberts would step out of the alleyway and stab him in the chest. He was then quickly picked up by friends and he was driven off. This wound could have been non-fatal, but Clark refused to go to the hospital until it was too late. And hours later, Edward Clark Jr. would be pronounced dead at the age of 17. He is the second and last definitive death related to Berzerk. Now, once again, after Clark's death, the rumor would resurface, and the stories would spread once again. And in only a few years, this story would make its way onto the internet, where it would continue to slip into mainstream culture. There are tons of YouTube videos on this subject, most of them being far better than this one, but that's beside the point. Some of my favorite YouTubers like Billy Styler and Scare Theater, and if you're not subscribed to him already, even though you watch this channel, what are you doing? But one of the best channels on the entire platform, Nexpo, also made a fantastic video on the subject. This story would then go on to inspire the many video game creepypastas that came later down the road, most specifically Polybius. Now, if you read Polybius, you reread it, you can see that it takes a lot of cues from the actual Berzerk incidents. That is assuming Polybius was never real and it wasn't actually a way for the CIA to reintroduce MKUltra, but that's a subject for another video. Now, with all that being said, let's ask the big question. Did Berzerk kill 3 people? The answer is no. Now, with Bukowski, for lack of a better term, his heart was kind of a ticking time bomb. It was bound to go off eventually. It was certain. It just happened to be wrong place at the wrong time. With Daly, his Berzerk story probably didn't exist, and with Clark, it also kind of feels like Roberts was kind of a ticking time bomb. Once again, going off eventually, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Oh, and also, for the record, I did play Berzerk for research and, not dead. One more thing, a lot of people like to mention these water towers outside Calumet City, and let me emphasize, these are creepy. These are really, really creepy. But I did some research on them, and it turns out that these are actually pretty common throughout Illinois. I even found some in Iowa and Chicago even. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the Berzerk deaths. To this day, the story still creeps out many, many people, making them wonder if maybe, what if their childhood video game was something far more sinister? Keeps you up at night. Thanks for watching. Peace.
Attacks are chicken. Chicken fight like a robot.